Hello, I'm Justin Clement. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn talk hosted by the Valley Forge Park Alliance. Now, we'll be joined today by Tyler Putman. He's the Gallery Interpretation Manager at the Museum of the American Revolution. It's been my pleasure to work with him at a few living history reenactments in the past hosted by the museum. Tyler Putman, he holds an MA in American Material Culture at the Winterthur program. In addition, he holds an MA and PhD at the University of Delaware. He's been a reenactor for almost 20 years, and he's a professional living historian since 2007. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you, Tyler Putman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks to everyone for making time for this talk today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with the Valley Forge Park Alliance, and I'm actually broadcasting you not from our shared home of Pennsylvania, but from Williamsburg, Virginia. My views don't represent those of Colonial Williamsburg, but the Taylors here have been gracious enough to let me use their great background. So you should be seeing me. I'm a younger white man with glasses, and I am sitting in front of a wall of fabric, if that gives you a picture of where we are today. And I think Justin and I are hoping that this is a conversation. So some of you have already identified the Q&A and the chat feature. Justin's going to be watching those, and I will happily be interrupted at any time to answer those, as well as at the end. I've left plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, I will give you something even more interesting to look at, which is a PowerPoint. And I'll just ask Justin if you guys are seeing a full screen at this point.
Looks good.
Cool. So this talk is about living history and reenacting. And although the title says between 1976 and 2026, I'm going to give you some deep prehistory, and then obviously we're not quite yet to 2026. So going to look into the future. The title slide has me dressed as a soldier in the Commander-in-Chief's Guard, which was the personal bodyguard of General Washington during the Revolutionary War. So it's a blue coat with yellow facings. I'm wearing a what's called a round hat with a big bearskin roach, they would have called it, this chunk of fur on the top, decorative piece of fur. And I know the Valley Forge Park Alliance and the park itself are really interested in living history and costume interpretation, and have been a site of that for decades. So today I wanted to give those of you for whom those are unfamiliar terms a deep background. And even if you're an old reenactor, or if you've been doing living history for years, I'm hoping there are some things that might spark new connections and that will allow you to think about the roots of this work and this hobby, and where we might head as we all look forward to the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War, the winter at Valley Forge, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. We're really, I think, collectively excited for these events, which are already happening in places like Boston, and will sort of move around the theater of the American Revolution as we advance forward. First, I just wanted to give you a short definition of these two different terms. So living history and reenacting, and I'm going to talk about both and maybe kind of jumble them today. But in the way that I think about it, living history is an interpretive practice. It's a technique and a methodology to achieve the aims of public historians. So that can be at a place like where I am, Colonial Williamsburg, a place like Valley Forge. It can be in a museum like the Museum of the American Revolution where I work, where we have folks in costume to accomplish our aims as educators. So it's sort of in the same way that a guided tour or a talk like this is a type of interpretation. We might think of living history as that way. And it usually means someone is in a costume, maybe doing something that they would have done in the past. Sometimes you might be in first person, which is a phrase we use, which means, if I was in first person while wearing the outfit you see on the screen, I would be saying, it's 1777, and I'm a member of the Commander-in-Chief's Guard, and I've been in the Revolutionary War for 3 years. You're sort of putting yourself in a role. Or you might be in third person, which is where I'm Tyler Putman. I'm dressed as a Revolutionary War soldier, and the things I'm doing, the clothing I'm wearing, are an additional tool. So just to use Williamsburg again as an example, if you meet an actor on the street, he might be pretending to be someone from the 18th century. But if you enter one of the trade shops, the woman working over an anvil in the blacksmith shop is in third person. She's an active blacksmith, but she's not pretending that she's from the 18th century. And then there's reenacting, which is a hobby in which people recreate the past. And they wear many of the same clothes and they do many of the same things. But generally, reenacting is something people do for fun. And it doesn't mean it's not educational. or useful, but most of the people who do a battle reenactment are essentially volunteers. They're doing it for a variety of reasons, but as an avocation, as a hobby versus as a job. Where that gets a little blurry is at places like Valley Forge, and I've got a great photo later on as an example of this, where you might see a staff member dressed as a Revolutionary War soldier, but on certain weekends, there are groups of reenactors who are doing living history programming at the park.
Tyler, just to let you know, there was a comment from one of the attendees that your microphone is cutting in and out.
Okay.
So yeah, just be aware of that. I don't know if you can kind of position yourself.
Sure. Yeah, maybe I'll get a little closer. Is that what you're hearing as well, Justin?
Maybe a little bit of interference.
Okay. Well, I apologize to everyone for that, and I am more than happy to repeat myself anytime that we are having that challenge. So this is the power and the glory of the Zoom universe that we live in, is that I don't have to worry about a microphone in my hands going off, but I do have to worry about this computer failing me.
There was a question about the Commander-in-Chief's uniform, or Guard uniform. So of course, Washington's Guard, they were normally in orders wearing blue and buff, the same as Washington's uniform.
Yeah.
But and research has shown that in 1777 in particular, the buff fabric was a little bit hard to come by. So Don Traiani, historian Jim Elcochin, and a few other people have interpreted that perhaps a pale yellow may have been substituted in place of buff for that year. So that is an answer to that question. It just goes to show sometimes the level of research that may go into a particular impression.
Yeah, I'm so glad you answered it really well. I'm so glad it was asked. If you're looking closely, you'll notice that there is a mismatch. And at different points in the war, the Guard may have been uniformed in buff, but the story and the letter which survives, which says they're struggling to get buff cloth and they found a yellow that they think is passable, was compelling enough as an interpretive document that we chose to recreate that precisely to inspire this sort of conversation. If you've never seen a Revolutionary War uniform, you're not going to notice, but if you are someone who spent a lot of time with this material, it can actually spark there's sort of a depth of conversation that can be sparked by these things that real experts will notice. So yeah, I'm glad folks asked. So where do we start? And I wanted to start with this incredible cave painting from the caves in Lascaux in France, the oldest example of human painted art, about 17,000 years before present. So maybe 18,000 years BC or BCE. And I want to start here because I think when we talk about reenacting and living history, we're talking about kind of embodied storytelling. So telling a story while also acting it out. And it's it's overlaps with theater, right? And I think as best as our anthropological work can tell us, humans have been telling stories and recreating things and recording memories for as long as we've been human. In fact, some non-human ancestors probably did this as well. So we can imagine the people who made these paintings may have been commemorating events, and you can imagine them around a campfire enacting stories of mythological events or of actual events, say a hunt that was very dramatic. So when the question might become, when does reenacting begin? What are its roots? And I think it depends on how you define it and what we mean. And so I wanted to start with this incredible image and then pull us about 17,000 years into the future to an image that Justin and I are very familiar with. And I know this is familiar to some of you, from the famous event called the Meschianza, which occurs in May of 1778, right at the end of what we call the British occupation of Philadelphia. So this is a familiar story to those of you who have spent time at Valley Forge. The Continental Army is out there that same winter from December 1777 into May or June of 1778, because the British have captured and occupied Philadelphia. Although it's probably worth noting from the perspective of perhaps 20,000 people who remained in Philadelphia, many of them might have seen this as a liberation and a return to the rightful jurisdiction and government of the British Crown. So that is a fascinating winter. It's the winter you guys are familiar with from the reshaping of the Continental Army in the log city at Valley Forge to the residency of thousands of British soldiers in Philadelphia, which was largely new for Philadelphia. This was, unlike Boston, a city that had not had a substantial military garrison ever, perhaps. So the presence of the British Army there is really just a fascinating story, as you can read about in some of Justin's work, in an amazing new book by Aaron Sullivan called The Disaffected. It's a great moment to explore like what the revolution meant at its midpoint. But as the British are preparing to depart back for New York to abandon the city, a man you may have heard of named Major John Andre, a British officer, particularly dramatic and theatrical and artistic person who records this visual image that May, stages a large pageant in which participants dress vaguely, at least, as Renaissance or medieval knights and ladies, have a jousting competition, this fabulous candlelit mirror-lined dinner at a country house south of the city, well within what is now Philadelphia, but what would have felt kind of like a retreat. They get there on these shoddily constructed boats floating down the Delaware River that struggle to even make it that far. And you can imagine how quickly this was put up, how many of the costumes and environments would have been, we might think of them something like paper mache and thin wood and quickly thrown together costumes, but they would have pulled off this really magnificent work of theater. And this included, in this image, mounted knights and servants with emblems of their different houses, enslaved people of color. There's a young boy dressed kind of in an Oriental, quote, fashion. And this was a dramatic event that did two things. Number one, it was just an enormous party for the British Army at a moment when a lot of people were kind of skeptical that they should be doing that. But it also harkened back to a deeper past. So in many ways, it was a form of reenactment, right? These are British officers who are imagining, idealizing a past moment. And in 1778, this was quite unusual. People would have been familiar with plays on the stage, but even most plays, when they were recreating a historical moment, didn't necessarily use historical dress. Certain plays, there might be, forms of togas to recreate classical Rome or Greece. But a number of plays that were about historical subjects used actors in contemporary clothing. There wasn't as much interest in, creating a really rich, immersive, authentic environment. And authenticity is a word we're going to return to later. So you can imagine how this kind of makes sense to us, right? It's like British soldiers going to medieval times restaurant or staging a Renaissance fair. But for the people in the moment, it was really strange and innovative and widely reviled. I mean, most people thought this was just a ludicrous thing for the British Army to be doing. Justin, anything you want to add about this event as someone who's studied it and thought about it much more than I have?
Well, it is interesting how, they are spending a fortune just in the pageantry itself, purchasing silks. A lot of people will say, well, they had control of the city. They could just, confiscate anything that they needed. But there was actually, I think, 22 investors that put down money for the pageant itself. But also, when we talk about accuracy or authenticity, something we'll probably get into a little bit later in his talk, it's fun to think that the swords, at one account, describes them as tin. But, so I'm wondering if they were like wood with like a tin sheeting over the top of them. But it gives you an idea, again, that there is this facade that's part of the party. It's not like they had a swordsmith, making these swords at the time. But yeah, very, very interesting event.
If we jump forward a little further, we might take another example from 1839, the Elgin Tournament, which is a similar event on a much larger scale, staged over a beautiful August weekend in 1839 at a Scottish estate. And this event, it is again about kind of recreating an idealized Renaissance or medieval past. You can see a scene here with mounted knights and lances, colorful tents in the background, all sorts of activity. This event was written up, painted, sketched, and it really helps launch, or maybe it embodies and then encourages a movement in England that then spreads to much of Europe and to America that is a form of a revival. This one is really related to what we think of as the Gothic revival, a kind of renewed interest in the arts, the architecture, the furniture from 400 or 500 years before its moment. And I wanted to highlight that because this is a transatlantic reenacting. Living history is a transatlantic movement, and it's been a transatlantic phenomenon, even though we think of it in, most of us are familiar with the American version. So in 1876, the United States celebrates its centennial, and we're all maybe more familiar with the bicentennial. I've got some great images of that, or the semi-quincentennial or sesquicentennial that we're all coming up to in 2026. But what 1876 does is really just inspire a nationwide movement that we now think of as the Colonial Revival. And the Colonial Revival of the Colonial Revivals are still felt today. So there's a giant exposition in Philadelphia, sort of a World's Fair in 1876, that includes the display of early American relics. In the upper left, you'll see it included a recreation of a colonial New England kitchen with furniture and a musket over the mantelpiece. You could sit in it, you could try colonial foods. In the bottom center, there's an amazing tintype in the collection of Nicole Bololin of women, probably in about 1870, 1880, dressed in some combination of actually original and reproduction colonial, they might have called it, clothing. So the woman in the center, for example, is wearing a floral gown that closes down the front. They have a variety of hairdos that they've worked out. So things like colonial teas become incredibly popular, sort of themed dining experiences. Not unlike today, there's a whole field of people who are often called costumers, sort of adjacent to reenacting, for whom they're not really interested in staging a battle or recreating a trade, but they might make a costume and then have an event like a picnic or a dinner where everyone is in costume from a particular moment. Or maybe there's a Jane Austen ball where everyone dresses in clothing from the early 19th century. The Colonial Revival is felt everywhere. So many of you may live in Colonial Revival houses. There's an example in the upper right. A lot of ranch houses echo the Colonial Revival in ways you have to kind of look for. And as many of us will know from our own decorations, or will remember from our parents' and grandparents' house, it's everywhere in the interiors of American homes. What kitchens look like, what living rooms look like. And this starts in the 1870s, but continues well into the present. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the Colonial Revival because it is, I think, maybe the most pivotal, it's like the rocket launch moment for what we think of as living history and reenacting. And these previous things are the research and the development and the test flights, but this is the moment where we've put a human on a space shuttle and we've fired it off the ground of Earth. And what comes next is to be determined. What it immediately also launches is living history as we know it today. So the 1920s and 1930s see the creation of innumerable historic houses where people are restoring houses and then in some cases recreating life inside of them, but also the creation of full landscapes. Greenfield Village, Old Sturbridge Village, Colonial Williamsburg in the lower left where I am today. These projects to recreate environments, mostly from the late 18th, or in Greenfield Village's case, sort of this pan 19th century environment, by collecting and restoring buildings. And relatively soon after that, places like Colonial Williamsburg realize that they have these incredible environments, but not everyone is going to learn just by looking at houses, and that houses and shops feel kind of empty without activity. So in the 1930s and the 1940s, there's some really innovative work done in what we now consider living history. So in the upper right, you see a stereo view used in one of those kind of binocular viewers of a woman spinning flax at Colonial Williamsburg. In the lower right, an early image of a blacksmith at work here. So this is where suddenly there's a new interest in people in costume recreating the past, not as a big singular moment, not as a pageant or a play, but as a practice and a complement to museum work. So the birth of living history happens in this moment and then continues from here. The mid-20th century sees really important events that change or maybe inform reenacting and change living history. And I've put up two of my favorite images from the 1940s. On the left, a poster in the collection of the Museum of the American Revolution. Americans will always fight for liberty, showing soldiers in 1943 dressed, and we might think of as this kind of GIs, marching past soldiers at Valley Forge, perhaps, soldiers standing in the snow wearing Revolutionary War uniforms in 1778 as the commander-in-chief's standard, an original flag that still exists also at the Museum of the American Revolution, fluttering over their heads. So World War II and the propaganda around the war really activate a memory of the American past for certain ends. Meanwhile, the 1940s and 1950s is the beginning of the Cold War. So everything we associate with the Cold War, the definition of American identity and nationalism as being contrary to a different system of government, all the good and bad things of the Cold War end up kind of filtering into reenacting. And I wanted to give you these images to set the stage for what comes next, for what we'll really start to recognize as something like what reenacting and living history are today. Because these two pivotal events, maybe the relatively finite qualities of World War II and the really decades-long Cold War struggle, are going to inform reenacting and living history up to the present. So at the end of World War II, two things happen that are pretty important. One is the number of American men who return home with military experience from the battlefield. So those men, not all of them, but many of them are really interested in target shooting, in using guns, in hunting. So you have this kind of new group of young men who are thinking about weapons in ways they might not have if they'd never gone into military service. And the other is an economic boom. So many of those men go to college on GI Bills, start new families, and have, if we're thinking about white men at least, have relatively high expendable income. So that is happening at the same moment that two new hobbies emerge. One is embodied by this incredible movie poster for Walt Disney's Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, starring Fess Parker, which debuted as a sort of mini-series, but then was launched as a film in 1955. And that's called the Buckskinning movement. So the Buckskinning movement is an early form of reenacting where people dress up as frontiersmen and maybe go out target shooting or stage kind of rendezvous encampments that still exist today.
Yeah, there's a rendezvous that happens a few miles from my parents' house. So it's always weird to go there and, see that there are people trapping and hunting and that you can still actually purchase furs, that, are being trapped or produced, and sold, not too different from, how it may have been before. So yeah, these events still are going on.
Yeah, there's still whole communities of people, buckskinners, and who engage in rendezvous. And I think what's interesting about the buckskinning movement is it's a little pan-historical. It's not always tied to a single moment. You don't need to dress like it's 1820 or 1850. It's not unlike the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is a group of people who focus on reenacting a kind of 400 or 500 year period, often thought of as kind of a medieval fair or a medieval reenactment. If you've seen something like that, that kind of like, we're not sure exactly what year we're in, but we're all thinking about a certain era. So buckskinning has still very active hobby, and it really takes off in the 1950s and 1960s. And I think we can kind of see its echoes in more precise historical reenactments that are seeking to recreate a single moment or a single period versus an early American past. One example of that is the birth of Civil War reenacting, which is still the largest branch of reenacting in America. This is an early issue from 1957 of American Rifleman, and it shows two Civil War reenactors in 1957. So one of the earliest images we have of people who are kind of recognizable as some version of Civil War reenactors. A lot of the equipment and the muskets they're carrying are original. The clothing might have been reproduction, but you can imagine a time in the 1950s where it was quite cheap to buy vintage Civil War things or surplus things. So many of these early reenactors are using largely historical objects. This kind of culminates in 1961 at the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, which is a National Park Service site, still is a National Park Service site. And there is a massive event staged there in April of 1961 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the first major battle of the Civil War. And this is often regarded as the first reenactment in the way that we see it today. So hundreds of almost entirely men in costume, and all white men in costume, and artillery, muskets firing. I love these two images because if you've been to a reenactment, the image on the left is actually not that different than reenactments that still happen, right? There's this clear audience spectator area. There's a cannon crew driven by horses pulling along in the front. The image on the right I like because it really sets the moment, right? There's this great vintage, well, what we would think of as vintage sheriff's car in the background, and two Confederate reenactors kind of lazing on the ground in front of it.
The exhaustion is familiar, for anyone who's taken part in a reenactment.
Yeah, I think, update the clothing a little bit and change the cop car, and that probably is, well, it didn't happen in 2020. It definitely happened in 2019 a lot. The 1961 reenactment is also super problematic because it destroys the landscape of Bull Run. There's huge problems with parking. The impact on the National Park Service battlefield is profound, and it leads the Park Service to implement a new policy about reenactments, because it's not like they really had to change things. This is the first try. So as a result, up until the present, the Park Service has a pretty stable policy against battle reenactments. So you will certainly see reenactors on national parks. You might even see them firing muskets, but there aren't these large opposing sides pretending like they're in the middle of the battle. And that policy has been refined and formulated over the years, but is really a legacy of this first National Park Service reenactment that kind of went off the rails in many ways. So the 1960s then see reenacting grow exponentially as the Civil War centennial continues. And I love these two images from the memoirs of a man named Ross M. Kimmel. It's a great guy, and you can read these online. I'll share the link at the end. It's called The Centennial Memoirs of Ross Kimmel. Ross started reenacting in 1961, and his memoirs sort of take you through each year of the 1960s. And so these images are incredible because on the left, you see Dwight Eisenhower inspecting Confederate soldiers. And on the right, you see those same soldiers meeting George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama. So I like these images because they remind us that reenacting is also not happening in a vacuum, right? It's deeply engaged with exactly the things that were happening in the 1940s and 1950s. And it's as much as it is ostensibly recreating a past moment, it's also really informed by what people in America are interested in when it's happening. What's on people's minds when George Wallace shakes the hand of a Confederate soldier, right? That really sends a message about segregation and Southern power and the lost cause narrative. What do people have in mind when Dwight Eisenhower is inspecting Confederate soldiers' arms? It's early in the Cold War. He, in his retirement speech, makes this famous statement about the danger of the military-industrial complex. But he's also someone who retires to Gettysburg, right? He has a deep military passion and past himself. So these events of the 1960s are feeling the echoes of the same things that people who had no interest in reenacting were feeling. Meanwhile, as I think most of us will know, the 1960s is a decade of turbulent social and political movements, right? It's the era of massive civil rights demonstrations for racial equality, for desegregation, for women's liberation, for disability rights, eventually, maybe a decade later for disability rights and for gay rights. And it's also the ramping up of the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. And in the same way that I wanted us to think about the influence of World War II and the Cold War on the birth of reenacting, I want us to think about these movements in the 1960s and 1970s as the kind of crucible for what reenacting will become. And what they inform is the American Bicentennial. So if we're going to think critically about what the bicentennial could have been, what it was, what people hoped it would be, who was included and who was excluded, we need to think about its roots in a maybe 10-year period of social disruption before we get to 1976. So imagine yourself as a Black woman or a white man or a Southerner or a Northerner. By the time you get to 1976, almost all of those people have a lot of anxiety about the state of the country, its role in the world, their inclusion in it, and what's going to happen next. These are just three of my favorite images. One is the logo of the American Revolution Bicentennial, which I think might have been one of its stronger aspects, actually, is the graphic design that went into that logo. In the upper right, you'll see many of us probably will have swag from the Bicentennial or have seen it in antique stores, but it was much like the Colonial Revival, which it's in many ways is a form of, it infiltrated department stores and convenience stores and American homes in really amazing ways. Magazine covers, products, packaging, television shows, bicycles. And the bicentennial takes many forms, right? There are large events like the movement of the Liberty Bell to a new center in Philadelphia, enormous speeches. In Philadelphia, for example, there are also counter events like what's called the Black Bicentennial, or a large folk festival that were meant to craft other narratives of the bicentennial period. There are reenactments all over at Revolutionary War battlefields. And one of my personal favorite largely untold stories is that of the Bicentennial Wagon Train, a group of probably 200 or 300 covered wagons that came from all over the country, ideally all of the 48 continental states, and slowly converged into a center at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania on July 4th, 1776, at this giant convention of covered wagons. And, you know, most of them weren't in costume, and covered wagons are not necessarily something we associate with the Revolutionary War, but it shows us how a lot of people are thinking about this moment as a chance to commemorate something about the American past. We can't quite figure out what it is. You know, my grandfather for his entire life wore a chin beard that he grew during the bicentennial. And you know, no one in the Revolutionary War had a chin beard, right? All men shaved, but all the people he worked with, all the men he worked with in 1976 grew this beard to kind of look like, I don't know, early pioneers perhaps. And he liked it enough to keep it. So the bicentennial is like centralized in some ways, but also really decentralized.
It's also a moment when Valley Forge went from being a state park into a national historical park.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jess. I'm glad you raised that, sort of the elevation of places like Valley Forge and other places to being nationally significant, or at least in the form of being acknowledged that way as a park site, happened in this period. Yeah. So as far as reenacting goes, I wanted to steal a few images from a great guy named Tom Braystead, who will be familiar to some of you, who's also written a cool set of memoirs about reenacting. He's there in the left with his mom in front of a cannon wearing an early impression, which is what reenactors call a sort of wardrobe. And Todd is an incredible scholar of loyalists in the Revolutionary War. So if you want to go down a deep rabbit hole about that work, he's really established some great resources online that help with genealogy or just storytelling. And so reenacting in the bicentennial starts to become quite like what it is today. So there are thousands of people involved in this, and it also diversifies a little bit, which is something that's worth dwelling on for a moment, because this is the time when especially more women and a handful of African Americans get involved in reenacting, which is not something that was especially common in the 1960s or for most of the 1970s. So while most of the images I've shown you over white men, that is intentional, because most of the people involved in reenacting up to this moment were white men. And even today, it's a largely white and, you know, disproportionately male hobby. That doesn't mean that living history is that way. And that's something I want to dip back into now that we've brought reenacting up into the 1970s. But in some ways, you know, if you adjusted the colors of these images, they wouldn't necessarily cue you into the they're from 40 years ago. And that's because there are some really interesting dynamic people in the 1970s and 1980s who do innovative new historical research about what the clothing looked like, who are figuring out how do you recreate a bearskin cap from a grenadier, or how do you cast pewter buttons, or how does the clothing fit, so that they push reenacting and authenticity, which we'll circle back to, into this new realm. Couple more images just to pull us slowly into the present from the possibly the largest American reenactment ever, the Battle of Gettysburg in 1988. It's hard to nail down what the biggest reenactment was, because you don't always know how many people are at these things. But the late 1980s and the early 1990s, as you'll see in this press image in the upper right, are enormously popular for reenacting, but also honestly somewhat hard to tell the story of, because they're recent enough that no one's written a history of this. There aren't a lot of great oral histories or memoirs in the way that there are from the 60s and 70s, as people realize that that's distant enough that it might be historic. But this is a moment when reenacting, so I should note that reenacting is really decentralized. There's no, there are a few sort of attempts at national organizations, but most reenactment groups are groups of 10 or 20 or 50 people centered in a particular town or who are interested in the Civil War regiment of their state, and they gather, they all come together at a reenactment, and then they disperse again. So it's also hard to trace because there's a couple national magazines, but there's no kind of big organizational file for how reenacting worked. 1990, 1993 has two fascinating cinema examples. Ken Burns' Civil War premieres on PBS, and the television miniseries and then movie produced by Ted Turner, Gettysburg. And what these do, even though I'm well aware that I've been spending some time on the Civil War, and many of you may like the Revolutionary War better, what they do is they capitalize on this burgeoning interest in reenacting that's been developing in the 80s, and they just launch it into a whole new world. So the late 80s and the mid 90s are probably when you have the most people in America engaged in reenacting. And the vast majority of those are doing Civil War, but many people who start in the Civil War, like me, eventually realize that it's stupid, so we should do something more interesting, like the Revolutionary War. But it can be the hook for people. It's the biggest thing. It's the easiest to get dressed up like a Civil War soldier and then maybe drift into reenacting World War I or reenacting the War of 1812. Justin, did you start out in Revolutionary War stuff, or have you ever had dabbles in other things?
No, Rev War from the beginning. So yeah, 1981 being hauled around to Fort Niagara in diapers, and been doing it ever since. Ever since.
That's cool. So what the 1980s and 1990s give us is something called the authentic movement in the hobby. And I would be arrogant to say this wasn't always part of reenacting. I mean, if you read the memoirs of Ross Kimmel, what they're doing in the early 1960s is trying to figure out what Civil War soldiers actually looked like, how they can make the clothing very accurate. But it's really not until the 80s or 90s that reenacting starts to kind of have a little more of a schism between people who are doing it for any number of quite valid reasons, as a family activity, as a way to travel, as a club and social event, and people who really, their primary objective is wearing things and using things that look as close to the real thing as they can. So this is an image on the left of a group of reenactors at Valley Forge. Some of you can, I don't know if you can figure out which hut that is, but it's out there. And these are authentic reenactors. So I'm not going to go too deep in the weeds of how you tell the difference, but I just wanted to cue you in that you can see, you know, the age is relatively young, all pretty slim guys, and they're wearing their clothing in a way that might look a little different, say, than some of Todd Braystead's images that we saw, like the example in the upper right. Granted, these are like 30 years apart, but I think that can show you that there's sort of a shift among some people to appear a little different. And if you're interested in this, I mean, it's just amazingly documented in Tony Horowitz's journalistic study, Confederates in the Attic, which is about Civil War memory and has a pretty substantial content on Civil War reenactors. Problematic book, but really interesting if you want to just kind of figure out this fascinating subculture as it existed in the 1990s. So let's get back to living history for a moment. And I've spent a lot of time talking about reenacting, but I wanted to return and say that meanwhile, living history museums are really also getting interested in authenticity and diversity. So in the same way that reenacting sort of exploring what it means and what they want to do, Colonial Williamsburg, for example, in 1990 implements their African-American interpretive program, which is explicitly keyed on making sure that we're telling Black stories and highlighting narratives that people might not encounter otherwise. And then meanwhile, you know, the trade shops at Williamsburg convert into doing things in new ways. Kerry Carson, a new interpretive chief here, implements all these changes that are really well documented in a book by two anthropologists, Richard Handler and Eric Gable, called The New History in an Old Museum. So if you want to read about how a place like Williamsburg goes through a major interpretive shift and what two anthropologists think of that kind of tribal culture, that's a really good place to start. So where do we go from here? You know, I'm really excited to answer any questions you have and engage with them in the last 20 minutes or so, but I wanted to give you just a few, maybe 4 big thinking points. And we've made it up to 2021. And as we look forward to 2026, what do I, as someone who works in the field, think are the key things we should be thinking about? So I'm, as Justin mentioned, I'm the gallery interpretation manager at the Museum of the American Revolution, which means, among other things, I oversee living history programming in inside a museum. I'm really jealous of you guys because you have a beautiful landscape and you can take people outside and imagine what things looked like. I have amazing objects. We have Washington's tent, which is incredible, but it's kind of a little different environment to think about how does it work when people are in costume. But a big part of my job and my profession is thinking about living history. So I wanted to give you guys some kind of key interpretive thoughts or priorities that we might, as a field and as people who are passionate about sharing this information, think about as we head towards 2026. The first is interpretation. So interpretation is a word for translating something into a way that someone else can understand better, right? And so this could be a movie, a talk, it could be a formal presentation by a park ranger, it could be a single conversation that happens in a hut at Valley Forge. A great place to start if you're thinking about interpretation is an almost ancient book called Interpreting Our Heritage by Freeman Tilden, which was a product of a National Park Service project in the 1950s and 1960s. And Tilden was a pioneer in what it meant to interpret both natural and historical resources. So one of his key points, for example, is that interpretation is not instruction, it's provocation. So the point is not downloading information, it's kind of changing people's minds and getting them to think in new ways. The way I think about interpretation is kind of in this triangle on the right. So most of your conversations might start with, what is it? You know, this is a musket, or it's a hut at Valley Forge. And, you know, then you can think about, what did it mean in the 1700s? This is where our storytelling can get really compelling. What does it mean that soldiers were living in huts at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777? If you're lucky with some guests, you get to talk about, what does it mean today? What's significant about the Valley Forge story in our life today? Why do we remember it? Why do we commemorate it? Why do we spend money preserving it? And then finally, this kind of pinnacle, we think of this kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, we've advanced from food and shelter up to self-actualization. Is what does it mean to me? What does it mean to the person you're talking to? Why should they care personally? You know, why should why should a South Asian visiting Philadelphia for the first time care that the British occupied it in 1777? And when you think carefully about it, you know, there's all sorts of exciting stories of military occupation and changing gender roles and the Army's recovery at Valley Forge that we can make relevant to those people, but we sometimes have to realize that their grounding, whether they're from Oklahoma or Cambodia, is going to be really different from ours, and it's not inherently interesting. You know, it's not that something is by its own right valuable or interesting, it's about how we make it that way.
Yeah, within the National Park Service, there's a large emphasis on facilitated dialogue. You know, so kind of this back and forth with your audience and trying to find out what is particularly relevant to your audience and working that in. You know, how does this history directly relate to the audience, and you know, what special relevance can they take away from your message? You know,
I think that's the art.
Yeah. So do you have any particular insight into facilitated dialogue? Is that something that the Museum of the American Revolution focuses on as a technique?
Yeah, by other names, perhaps. We do a lot of that. You know, for us, it's about, I would say our biggest priority is, you know, our biggest priority is that people come and they feel like they got something different or they were changed in some way by the museum experience. And, you know, that could be as big as like, whoa, the revolution was more complicated than I thought. That would be a great learning objective, right? Or it can be finite, like George Washington enslaved a man named William Lee, who probably lived in that tent the whole time in the Revolutionary War. What was that relationship like, right? But one tactic we use to do that is to ask guest questions, which is a form of facilitated dialogue really early on in their experience, because I'm sure we've all been on less than great tours where, you know, maybe halfway through the tour, the guide says, and where were you guys from? And by then, you know, you have no interest in answering that question. Like, you've gone and you've shut down, right? But if you can establish a relationship with guests early on where they've said something, you've said something, you've both shown that you're willing to ask and answer questions, then you can get to the really interesting stuff, the more challenging stuff, because you've sort of scaffolded your way up to that point. You've sort of turned the water up very slowly versus dropping them in the boiling water, for whatever metaphor I'm making here.
All right.
The second of these 4 points I want to talk about was diversity. And I think diversity can mean a lot of different things. So I wanted to just give you 3 images from programming in the last month at the Museum of the American Revolution. The left is a costume interpreter dressed, relatively well-to-do merchant of Philadelphia, perhaps at the height of the Revolutionary War. In the middle is a woman showing a hand-sewn revolutionary flag. It has these big 6-pointed stars on it to 2 young girls. On the right is an interpreter named Noah Lewis, who I know you guys may know at Valley Forge, talking to 2 guests. He's dressed in the clothing of the 1820s. So he's telling the story of a man named Ned Hector, Revolutionary War soldier. But by the 1820s, Ned Hector, the revolution is 40 years before, and Ned Hector has been rejected from pensions multiple times. So what does the war look like from his perspective and his memory? And I think diversity is important because people really need to see people like them to imagine what the past was like. So if you go to a place and it's all older white people and you're a young Black person, it's much harder for you to imagine what your life might have been like in that moment. So I think the best costume interpretation ensures that there are a lot of different faces and economic levels and races and genders being presented. And that doesn't mean that someone like me can't connect with Gianna Violanti, a flag maker. But there are a lot of our guests who are, when they see someone like them, it's like a magnet. They're like, whoa, I want to talk to you because I can suddenly see myself in that role.
So if I may ask, what are some of the challenges then with diversity? Because within the living history reenacting community, finding people who are comfortable talking. So for example, an African-American individual, they may constantly be assaulted with the question, are you a slave?
Sure.
This is something I've witnessed at Colonial Williamsburg that takes an emotional toll. There's a reason why many shy away from reenacting. So as an educational institution, how do you encourage diversity amongst your interpreters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that. And if folks are grappling with this question, I might recommend the work of a woman named Cheney McKnight, who runs a operation called Not Your Mama's History, who has talked on YouTube and written really compellingly about the reasons behind this and what we might do about it. I think it's kind of a twofold challenge. One is you have to do exactly what Justin pointed out, which is recognize that the experience of interpretive work or of reenacting is different depending on who you are, right? If you're a woman in costume, people might treat you very differently than if you were a woman just dressed in a museum polo shirt and a pair of khaki pants. Often, guests feel like some rules of civility and proper conduct are kind of off because we're all play acting like it's the 18th century. So I can say radically inappropriate things because I think I've been given permission to act that way. And as Justin pointed out, in the case of African Americans, I think you have to recognize that there is an emotional toll and a trauma, both inherited and active, that comes with this work. So the first step is realizing like there are very good reasons why both the hobby of reenacting and the profession of living history are predominantly white and have often at many sites been mostly delivered by white men. Although I think, larger sites and ones with really creative managers have worked on that intensively. So in our case as a museum, I can say that we're large enough and have enough very generous supporters that we can actively contribute to shifting the field. So we're in the middle of a 3-year initiative called the Diversify Living History Initiative, which seeks to recruit, support, and create more interpreters of color. So that includes guest residencies by people like Noah Lewis and Cheney McKnight, as well as kind of working with an advisory committee of community members to ensure that I, for example, as a white man, am understanding the situation from the perspective of others. And also next year, we'll be doing a summer institute for young people that will kind of seek to introduce young people of color to the world of living history as a profession, as something that you can do as a job, but also responsibly prepare them to do that work without just assuming that it'll be as easy for it as it is for me. As Justin pointed out, when I'm dressed up like a Revolutionary War soldier, almost the only time slavery comes up is when I raise it, right? I'm the one who's an interpreter kind of pushing this as a learning objective. If I was a Black man, slavery would come up almost certainly in the majority of conversations I have with people. And that can be good or bad, right? You can use those interpreters to encourage certain conversations, but it also means collectively as a staff, you have to make sure that if you're white, you're not just returning to your usual interpretive points and missing the power of Black stories, or in the case of men, of women's stories. You have to really actively interpret those things. The third point is authenticity. And I didn't want to get into the weeds of showing you like bad reenactors and good reenactors. So I'm showing you a costume on the left, and some really good reenactors from a regiment, the 17th Regiment of Foot in America, at an event at the Museum of the American Revolution. And I think authenticity is tricky because it's really easy to get bogged down in a kind of navel-gazing antiquarianism, right? Of like, the buttons are wrong because the buttons are wrong, and that's important because the buttons are wrong. But you have to think about, why do we care, right? I'm someone who's really committed and work in an institution that's really committed, for example, to guaranteeing that all the visible sewing on garments is done by hand. And we have the resources to support that. And that's a big privilege, right? A lot of sites literally can't afford to do that. And I know Justin and the Valley Forge Park Alliance have been doing great work with the tailoring brigade to sort of rethink and implement exciting new examples of this. But I think the reason authenticity is important is related to my final point of empathy, and it's because we need to look realistic to accomplish our aims of proving to people that the past actually happened, right? And so a lot of people come to our museum, they may come to Valley Forge, and they think Washington was an infallible marble man who knew exactly what was going to happen next, and it was all preordained, right? The Revolutionary War was going to be won by the revolutionaries. We were going to have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And as we know as historians, when you read the sources, nobody knows what's happening next, right? We're in 2021. I have no clue what's happening next. In 50 years, they'll say, oh yeah, they probably knew that it was all going to be okay, or whatever was going to happen. But in order to get people to realize that there was this contingency, this uncertainty of what was going to happen next, you first have to convince them that the past was real, that it actually happened to actual people who lived in this clothing, who walked the streets, and who looked like, that was what they did every day.
Yeah, I've certainly encountered people who are interpreting. It's a costumed interpretation, but if they haven't put a lot of work into the impression, when I approach them, I really question how much I can actually learn from them. If this person doesn't have much self-respect in the impression, then how much could they really teach me? So, there are plenty of times when I've turned on my heels and walked away because I've realized that, this person, they might have some knowledge, but, they aren't really taking the role seriously enough. I don't see that self-respect. Now, I've also heard this notion that there are generational differences in values, that perhaps an older generation of visitors like to feel some level of exclusive benefits, especially donors, but a younger generation values authenticity, as the reverse of fakeness, right? I think the concept that millennials hate fakeness, is probably something that we've all heard at some point in time. So the idea that you're appealing to a younger generation by working a bit harder to nail that authenticity, I think that is something that museums could take into account. Is that something you've encountered, a difference in generational values?
That's really an interesting point. That's something I would have to think more about. I think we have thought a lot about what authenticity means in the living history sense, but also in the experiential sense. So a good example of this is I've watched at events and at programs we've run where guests who you think would not be able to tell the difference, because the other counter argument is like, nobody can really tell, that this guy is dressed with hand-sewn clothing and that guy's not. But I've watched people react to folks like interpreters in the 17th and say like, oh, you're like the real thing, or folks in the 40th foot, you see some of those soldiers down at the end be like, you look like a real soldier. And I think the average guest probably has a surprising amount of visual vocabulary. It doesn't mean they're always activating it, but they can often tell what is authentic, what environments feel authentic, and what feel theatrical or fake or shoddy. What the Meschianza version versus the real version.
Yeah, it's interesting because I will often hear detractors who don't want to put any effort into the material culture, the clothing, or the impression. And the argument that they'll make is, well, the audience, they don't know the difference. But what I have often found is, even if they don't have an education in 18th century material culture and they don't know the difference in a technical sense, they often sense it. They know when someone it has a greater feel of authenticity, even if they can't really put their finger on why. And I find some of the work that we've been doing with the Tailoring Brigade, and for those listening, this is a volunteer group with Valley Forge National Historical Park, where we make, repair, and alter clothing. And partly we're trying to do this to update the accuracy of the clothing, but also make sure that it fits the individual, because in the 18th century, they don't have off the rack clothing. Material would fit you a lot better than you may expect. So this being the case, I find that when an interpreter is put into clothing that fits, that they themselves have the feel of accuracy when they're wearing the clothing, that there's a certain confidence that the interpreter may exude as a result of having clothing that feels more real. You often hear this with actors too, that they get into the impression, versus like a small production film versus, a large production where they're immersed in the era. It certainly helps them get into the impression, the role.
That's a great point. I like that.
We do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
One being, there's someone who is on the committee for the American Friends of Lafayette, Bicentennial, the Lafayette's farewell tour. So the question being, how do you approach groups? So the Museum of the American Revolution has been very selective with the groups that you've chosen to work with. So for someone that's part of an organization that's looking to involve living history reenactors, how do you approach groups, whether it's reenacting groups, individual interpreters, guilds, schools, Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution chapters? Where do you go to seek out quality interpreters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked, and I'll put a resource up on my final slide. It's called Working with Reenactors at Your Historic Site, and it's available on the webpage of Sustaining Places, which is an initiative of the University of Delaware's Museum Studies program, also available on my website. It's a packet about how do you do this sort of thing? How do you find reenactors? How do you vet them? I would say two things. One is that when you hire, recruit, offer a platform for reenactors, they are representing your site and your organization. So you need to be really sure that they are almost like temporary staff. Do they understand your goals? Are they going to represent you correctly? Are they going to accomplish your mission? And the mission might be talking to people. It might be having a big battle. It might be cooking something over a campfire, but you need to make sure you're both really clear on what your objectives are and that you're okay when you step away with those people presenting the face of the American Friends of Lafayette or of a historic house. And the other is that thanks to the internet, you can do a lot of this vetting remotely. You can explore unit websites. You can see who seems to be committed to the same educational goals you are. And then most of them are quite responsive. But that packet is, I think, a really good resource that might help you. I will just quickly give you guys a final slide before we wrap up, and then I want to take any other questions you have, which is about a final point about empathy. And I think at the museum, and many of us share this goal, one of our big goals is creating a sense of historical empathy, which I gestured to, which is imagining connections and a sense of experiential shared identity with people in the past. So what we're really interested in cultivating is historical empathy, imagining that you can sort of get a sense of what it was like as a goal of driving us towards maybe a more empathetic presence. If we can imagine what it was like for someone to go through these events in the 18th century, I might be able to imagine what someone else's life is like today. And I think that's something that the world could certainly use more of. So all the things I've talked about the history of reenacting, the problems with the challenges of the work, diversity, authenticity, are really, for us at least, and for me, driving towards this big goal of a sense of reality and a sense of empathy. So while I answer any questions, I'll leave you with this slide, which is also available. I know this will be on YouTube, so you'll be able to pause at this point. You can see any of these resources. These are some of the books I mentioned and some of the sources that might be of interest. So thank you again. This ends the formal part of my talk, but Justin, I'd be delighted to stay as long as you want to have me to answer questions.
Sure. So we do have one question. One of our attendees mentioned an experience at Hope Lodge in which the British wheeled to face the audience and did a quick step rapidly towards the audience. One wonders if it was actually a bayonet charge or not, but it gave them an experience to what it may be like, facing the British across the battlefield instead of just discussion. So do you have any thoughts about how to get the audience to experience or somehow participate in the interpretation?
Yeah, what a great question. Thank you for asking us. So I think what reenacting has given me as a historian is a much more immediate sensory image of the past. So when I read about marching with a knapsack or what a fire smelled like in a house, I can imagine those things. And the more we can do that to folks who might never put on a costume, the better. So I think that's the advantage of this. That's just sort of the goal of living history, right? Is giving you these little flashbulb memories of what the interior of a shop looked like or otherwise. But the other thing is, the best interpretation is really, it is engaging, and it's about, can you touch this thing? Can you feel how heavy this musket is? Can you watch, and I can help you understand this environment. That's pretty difficult with a battle reenactment, although as that person mentioned, there are ways to at least get a visual and kind of physical sense of it. But if you're a practicing living historian or reenactor, the more you can put things in people's hands and invite them into this, kind of through the fourth wall into the world that you're inhabiting, I think the better.
And one thing I would like to point out, circling back to the question of recruiting interpreters, at times you will have to expect to compensate people for the work that they're doing. So living history reenactors, a good number of people are volunteers. They do this for fun as part of a hobby. But more often than not, the more skilled interpreters, particularly people of color, and we've talked about the emotional trauma or toll that it takes upon them to engage in these conversations with the public, you may find that you have to compensate them for the work that they're doing, right? I mean, if it takes an additional emotional toll, well, you can't expect them to work for free, right?
Sure.
So,
yeah. No, that's exactly. And I think another vote in the favor of that is that when you pay someone, you can establish a contractual relationship that has parameters. So you can really guarantee that your expectations are matched in a way that's tied to finances. So I think that's exactly right. I think as a field, we're moving towards a world where that is becoming the best practices and the standards for all the reasons you said.
So I suppose the only final question I have is just regarding authenticity. I know you've talked about, you've hosted workshops on doing authenticity on a budget. So yeah. I know that's a loaded question, but it is probably easier to make clothing right once rather than making clothing poorly and then having to replace it down the line. So really, do you have any advice for institutions or people interested in getting involved in living history reenactments, how to basically obtain clothing that is accurate rather than finding out after a certain point in time that you don't look the part?
Yeah, I think that is a constant challenge. I'm realistic enough to know that I work at an institution that has made authenticity and accuracy a key part of our mission, and that we have the advantage of having the financial resources to back that. And that's not universal. So a couple points of advice that might be useful is, as Justin said, it's much better to buy one coat than a really bad coat and 6 months later have to buy the coat you should have bought in the first place. So I always recommend that people kind of pump the brakes when they're excited about getting into this and talk to people and do some research and spend a lot of time on the internet so they can kind of learn more before they just buy, the first coat that comes across their radar. And the other advice I give to historic sites is that, while I have the luxury of being a purist, there are also great ways of getting your costume staff light years closer without huge investments. And that might be like focus on the outer layer and the headgear. Because if you can get a good outer layer, and if if you're a soldier, you can get the kind of accoutrements adjusted so that they don't look like they're hanging around your knees, and you get a nice hat, the vast majority of people aren't necessarily going to notice if your waistcoat and your shirt have room lacking. So that's sort of what I think about is like, if you can create a veneer, you can work to rebuild the interior. It's like a Wild West saloon. The front looks like it's this glorious 3-story building. You go in and you're like, oh, the walls aren't even plastered, but you'll get there in like 5 years as the town develops. You can plaster the inside. And that is also something that, as Justin mentioned, there's some great resources online through a variety of organizations about kind of progressing towards an eventual goal.
Yeah, I also, as a tailor, talk about fit, because you can tell when something doesn't look right at 100 yards.
Yep.
But that's all about the fit. Whether a woman is wearing stays to giving you the 18th century profile, I mean, you could have clothing made out of polyester. Not that I recommend it, but but if it had the right fit, it looks good at 50 yards, 100 yards. So there is that. Think about the profile. 18th century clothing is made tailored to fit. So those are some things to think about.
And tailoring is quite, tailoring coat things in is quite affordable. Like that is definitely something that's a lower bar, is just paying someone who knows what they're doing to kind of pinch it in the right places.
Yeah. Now, I do think the Museum of the American Revolution, I personally think a lot of their success has been due to that commitment to accuracy. It certainly made an impression on me. There are many other aspects of that have contributed to the museum's success, but when it comes to living history, that has been a big focus. Have you found that presenting that accuracy in your advertising, I mean, we've seen the posters and so on, do you think that's a major contributor to kind of the feedback that you've gotten, or the enthusiasm perhaps of your guests?
That's a great question. It's very, very kind words. I think our challenge and accomplishments all have to do with how many people we can convince that, like, you might have spent your whole life thinking museums and the American Revolution were not for you, right? Those are like two strikes against us. We're a museum, we're about the American Revolution. For a lot of Americans, a lot of people from around the world, rightfully so, those aren't things that have been open to them for generations. But if we can present, a Black woman in a costume that looks like she's been wearing it on a banner, like, that can do huge steps to getting someone just to self-select in, like, come through the doors. Once you're through the doors, man, the job is over. Like, we've got amazing objects, we've got all this cool stuff, we've got great stories. And the other thing I would say is that we really believe that, we spent all this money installing amazing objects, building a replica ship, creating these life-size tableau figures that themselves have hand-sewn clothing. And if the people you see on the billboards and the people on the ground don't look that good, then, like, what? It's not going to work, right? It's going to look like, oh, the museum's great, but I have no idea who that clown was who was walking around, So, and I think people definitely notice that. So it's a combination of who's in the clothing and what does the clothing look like, and then where are people experiencing it.
Yeah. Definitely challenging times with COVID, but that's a whole nother conversation. But Tyler, this has been fantastic. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks to everyone. Open invitation to visit the museum, and I can't wait to get up to Valley Forge.
Sounds good. All right. Take care.
Thanks, guys.